続きましてバリー・ナッサー先生のご講演です。ナッサー先生はジョンズ・ホプキンズ大学高等国際関係大学院サイスの所長でいらっしゃいます。演題は The Stabilization of the Muslim World and the Global Implications イスラム世界の不安定化と世界への影響です。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here at TRU, and I'm very pleased as Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS to be partnering with TRU on this symposium. It's also very good to be in company of Kodokomoto-san and Professor Nai. And I'll follow up on the lead that Professor Nai provided. As he suggested, whereas one can be sanguine about the general global liberal order and the role of the United States in it, it's very difficult to be optimistic about the Middle East. And in particular, we're dealing with the Middle East at a point in time that it poses some of the greatest challenges and perhaps threats to the international order. One of the key issues that we're grappling with, the Middle East has for a very long time posed challenges to the international order. It's not the very first time that we have seen war, instability, terrorism in the region. But what is perhaps unique is that we're seeing some broader drivers for sustained instability going forward that is going to be a significant challenge to the international order. The Middle East has not been a great participant in globalization. If we went back to 2008, for instance, just because before the international financial crisis, the collective exports of the Arab world, if you excluded oil, would have been less than that of Finland. It had very little participation in the supply chain of the global economy. It was not participant in the kind of economic forces that were transforming Southeast Asia, Latin America, South Asia, and many other areas in the developing world. But even those parts of the Middle East that were participant in globalization, or that were looking to participate in the global economic order as a way of addressing economic issues in the region, are now facing a great deal of difficulty because of the slowing of the global growth. It is impacting countries from Turkey to Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and farther east Bangladesh, and that clearly is going to have an impact going forward. The second important factor for instability in the region going forward is low oil prices. Professor Nai referred to the shale oil revolution in the United States, in the manner in which the United States is fast becoming the world's most important oil producer, the one that holds swing capacity in the market. And that it is not only is becoming largely self-sufficient in terms of oil imports, but is actually creating a greater deal of self-sufficiency from the Middle East in the global oil markets. Now, that may be very good news for the United States, but it's not good news for large oil producers in the Middle East. So countries from Iraq to Saudi Arabia to Algeria are looking at very difficult economic circumstances going forward. So oil estimated to remain around $50 to $60 a barrel. A country like Saudi Arabia, whose budget requires $90 a barrel oil in order to be in balance, is looking at a situation that either it has to cut spending on varieties of things significantly, or undertake very difficult economic restructuring, or risk getting into greater debt. The International Monetary Fund, for instance, has estimated that at current rates of expenditure of budget, Saudi Arabia would run out of its sovereign wealth within 5 to 7 years. Now, that of course means that these large countries are going to be going through contractions and also instability going forward, and that's going to have also impact on other countries. The large oil producers in the region subsidize the economies of a larger number of countries in North Africa and the Middle East, either by employing their labor in the Persian Gulf region or actually providing subsidy to their budgets. For instance, countries as diverse as Jordan, Palestinian territories, Morocco, Pakistan, they all are looking at secondary effects from the reduction in oil prices. Oil, in fact, addressing the challenge of low oil prices is likely to be bringing to the region a certain degree of political instability going forward. But the most important driver of instability in the region currently is what's happening to the Arab world. I mean, if we sort of stood back and thought about what is the biggest development in the Middle East, is the utter collapse of order in the Arab world. And that is an important change in global security framework. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Arab world has largely been the bastion of stability in the Middle East. This is where the United States policy was anchored in order to contain Iran, in order to manage regional developments. It is this sort of existence of relative stability in the Arab world that was the bedrock of our policy, but also of global stability. Now, the Arab world has by and large completely imploded. We are looking at a situation in which two of the largest Arab countries, I would say the equivalents of Germany and France of Europe, that is Iraq and Syria, two historical countries, literally have ceased to exist since 2011. A shadow of a central government that barely controls even the capital city, with large parts of the country under the control of non-government actors or various other ethnic groups, sects, tribes, and the like. There are civil wars going out in a number of countries, Iraq and Syria, but also Libya and Yemen. The hope that existed with the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011 when there were uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, and then across the Arab world, where populations began to demand jobs, integrity, freedom. It created a sense of optimism that the Middle East would go through a period of democratization somewhat akin to what happened in Eastern Europe, actually has turned out to be something very different. It didn't end up being a political transformation of the region in a way that would integrate it into the global economic and political order. But rather, what it ended up being is that in the best cases, such as in Tunisia or Egypt, it ended up weakening state institutions without actually building new effective governing institutions in its place. And even a country like Egypt, after a military coup that tried to restore the old order, has not been able to restore the same authority to state institutions that existed before. Even today, Egypt has difficulty asserting security control, for instance, over the Sinai Peninsula. Secondly, the Arab Spring actually exposed significant divisions in the Arab world, which were very much absent from our purview or were not important to the regional dynamics. We didn't think of the Arab world as a place that's deeply divided between sects. I mean, the terms like Shia and Sunni were absent from vocabulary before 2003. Or we didn't think in terms of Kurdish versus Arab or Turkish versus Arab. And all of these divisions that existed within society ended up coming to the fore. States that were fairly homogeneous in North Africa, those similar states in the heartland of the Middle East were very divided. Now, the United States perhaps started this process in the Middle East with its invasion of Iraq and breaking down the Iraqi state, but then the Arab Spring essentially continued that process in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, and what we saw is that once state institutions started to collapse in the Arab world, it opened an arena for competition between winners and losers in order to decide who will control the states. One of the peculiarities of the Arab world is that where the primary identity is still Arab, people identify as Arab, people identify as Iraqi or as Syrian, but they don't have a sense of what Iraq means or what Syria means or what Libya means and which ethnic group or sect gets to define what it means. And what we're seeing is a major battle for defining what cultural identity, what ethnic identity, what sectarian identity will shape the states going forward. The result of this competition has been complete collapse of states as we know it in the heartland of the Middle East. In a peculiar way, the map of the region that was drawn after World War I between France and Great Britain, Turkey and other European powers that define the boundaries of Syria, Palestinian territories, Iraq, is now very much open to contestation. So when the president of Turkey, only yesterday, 2 days ago, asserts that Turkey has a historical responsibility to the city of Mosul, because Mosul at one time was an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, in effect, he is attesting to the fact that the territorial boundaries of nation states in the Middle East actually do not hold the meaning as they did before. And in fact, the major challenge before the international community is how to help the Middle East, particularly the Arab heartland of it, to get from where it was in 2011 to another point of equilibrium. The equilibrium that had existed in the region for about a century is now contested, it's not viable, it's not easy to maintain, it's difficult to go back to, but there ultimately has to be another equilibrium. The goal of the international community is to keep the territorial shape of Iraq and Syria intact, but there is no consensus about division of power or sharing of authority in those territories together. And I think the task that faces the international community going forward and a new U.S. administration is how to negotiate a grand, if you would, political settlement to the current set of conflicts in the region, which would be nothing short of what happened after World War I. And that still remains to be decided. Now, in the context of this collapse of authority in the Arab world, to which we don't have an easy solution, but we're rather just dealing with the consequences of this collapse of authority, actually power in the region has shifted to its non-Arab part. And in that context, I'm not including Israel because Israel sits outside of the regional debates and contestation of power. But the two other major non-Arab nation states in the region, which are Iran and Turkey, have essentially become, if you would, far more important in the region. So one of the ironies of the Middle East today is actually Iran is perhaps the most stable country in the Middle East, in terms of its domestic politics and even in terms of its territorial boundaries. More stable than Turkey, which just survived a military coup that almost undid its institutions and is actually engaged even in a mini-civil war between its majority Turkish population and its Kurdish minority. But both Iran and Turkey are exercising far greater power and influence in the region. Rather than the Arab world being the stable basis for Western power in order to contain Iran, Turkey and Iran are increasingly becoming the means by which the West will ultimately have to manage the affairs of the Arab world. So if you look at both Iraq and Syria, these two regional powers played a very dominant role in terms of deciding the shape of the conflict, the direction it's going to take, and ultimately the settlement that we might arrive in these two countries. Now, in the middle of this, the United States and its international allies, the so-called P5+1, 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and Germany, arrived at a nuclear deal with Iran. And this nuclear deal can be understood in the context of the dynamics of Iran's pursuit of nuclear technology and the West's reaction to it. But within the context of the Middle East, it was understood particularly by Arab countries like Saudi Arabia as a clear shift by the United States in the direction of Iran. At a time when the Arab world is losing its own coherence and is imploding, that this ability of Iran to, if you would, woo the United States to the negotiating table and arrive at a deal was understood by many Arabs to be the beginning of a much larger shift by the United States away from the Arab world and in the direction of Iran. In fact, that has explains the very severe reaction that Saudi Arabia has shown to the deal and the escalation of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the resistance that the Arab world is showing to greater Iranian influence in Syria and Iraq. The United States does not look at the nuclear deal with Iran as a major pivot away from the Arab world towards Iran, but the Arab world had understood the nuclear deal as a major change in the U.S.'s position in the region. Now, Iran, of course, faces a serious resistance to exercising influence in the Arab world, but for now, it remains a major player in Iraq in terms of its support for the central government in Iraq, a major player in Syria, where in alliance with Russia, it is exercising a great deal of influence in the flow of the war, and also in Yemen, where on the flank of Saudi Arabia, it is supporting an insurgency that has turned into an ongoing civil war. The other major regional actor is Turkey. Turkey, since 2011, has, and even before, had looked to the Middle East as essentially its near abroad, as a place that it would grow back its influence. Now, going back to World War I, when World War I was settled, Turkey decided that it really didn't want to have anything to do with the Middle East. It saw itself as a European power. It had a very difficult relationship with Arab territories during World War I. Countries like Syria, fought against the Turkish army in order to secure independence for the country. And Turkey was absent from the Middle East for close to a century. Under the current Prime Minister of Turkey, beginning in 2001, Turkey began to re-engage the Middle East. First in the form of greater trade and extending globalization, if you would, through the Arab world, but increasingly much more directly. And when Arab Spring happened and the civil war in Syria started, Turkey looked at overthrow of the Assad regime as well as the overthrow of the Mubarak regime in Egypt as an opportunity to extend its own model to these countries and to bring them much more closely under Turkish tutelage. The strategy did not work. In Egypt, the military coup reversed the democratic process that Turkey was hoping it would take advantage of, and in Syria, Turkey invested all of its fortune in the fall of President Assad, which has not materialized yet. But Turkey now sees both a danger and opportunity in Syria and in Iraq. And if one were to listen to the Turkish President Erdogan the past 2 weeks of trying to force Turkey's way into Iraq, of asserting control over Kurdish regions of Syria, sending Turkish tanks into Syria, what we're seeing is a much greater role for Turkey in the Arab world. And the rivalry is actually between now Iran and Turkey about who would come to the fore in both of these countries. Now, aside from this regional rivalry, which is an important dynamic, we're seeing also a return to terrorism in the Middle East. The collapse of state authority has opened the door for varieties of radical movements to rear their head. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the so-called ISIS, is the one that has been most at the forefront of international attention. But in Syria and Iraq, we're also witnessing a revival of Al-Qaeda, as well as a number of other groups. That has been the focus of Western attention in these countries, but it has to be understood in the broader context of collapse of state authority and the fact that ultimately the fate of these countries has yet to be decided. Finally, an important sort of both consequence of this collapse of order in the Arab world and what might be a cause of continuing instability in the region is a massive refugee crisis. The scale of refugee crisis within the Middle East is unprecedented. Syria itself has generated about a third of the country's population has left the country. An additional 10% of the population is displaced within Syria itself. This is a sort of a humanitarian disaster of tremendous proportions, but it's also politically and geostrategically consequential. For instance, the population of Syrian refugees in Jordan now is equivalent to 25% of that country's population. The largest refugee camp in Jordan its population is equivalent to the 4th largest city in Jordan. The amount of refugees that have migrated to Lebanon has changed the ethnic balance of Lebanon, the balance of power between Shias and Sunnis and Maronites, which had sort of held very tenuously since the 1970s, is now no longer there. I mean, one of the reasons why the Lebanese Hezbollah is very engaged in Syria is also to finish the war in order to push the refugees back out of Lebanon into Syria. Now, the economies of Jordan or Lebanon is not able to manage this volume of refugees. Is not able to provide them with employment or education or sustenance. And ultimately, these countries are looking at instability in trying to deal with the refugee crisis. There's been very little international support, material international support to Jordan or Lebanon for managing the refugee crisis. Turkey also has a large population of refugees, but Turkey is much better positioned to manage that. Now, all of these put together, the soft global economy, the downturn in oil prices, the collapse of the Arab world, terrorism, refugees, all suggest, as Professor Nye said, that the Middle East is in for a period of rough ride with very few state institutions capable of managing anything other than Iran and Turkey, which, not being Arab countries, their intrusion in the Arab world tends to cause more problems than provide solutions. We can work with Turkey, which is a NATO ally, but with Iran it's very difficult to openly work on anything right now. And as a result, it's difficult to see how these sort of myriad of problems going forward will be managed. So what is the impact for global order? So one way of thinking about the Middle East is that we can nibble at the edges and try to see how we can bring some of these conflicts to an end and think about bringing some degree of order to the region. But more importantly, perhaps the international community will have to find ways to contain the Middle East and contain these ongoing conflicts in the region from having a broader impact on the positive picture that Professor Nye was suggesting, that it is within the trends that we are seeing elsewhere outside of the Middle East. So, but the impacts are likely to continue and likely to be raised. And what are these? And this is not by any means an exhaustive list. But one of the big dangers that the Middle East poses, and one that was not foreseen, is actually the impact of refugees outside of Europe. Now, whether the refugees sort of poured out of Europe because of just the bombing that was coming out of Syria, or whether it is that Russia or Turkey, as it was said, at some point in time weaponized refugees. In other words, deliberately used refugees as a strategic tool against Europe. The refugees have now become a very big problem in Europe. A problem that is not so much about whether or not Europe can provide humanitarian assistance, but that European political systems are showing tremendous amount of vulnerability to refugee flows. So the rise of fascist right in Europe is being in many ways influenced by the ebb and flow of refugees. It is impacting the balance of power in Europe. So Germany decided to be much more receptive to refugees than some other European countries were. But in the refugee problem, the most powerful leader of Europe, Angela Merkel, had a drop-off in her approval rating from 76% to 42%, and has lost a number of key regional elections to hard right political parties. And refugees have emerged as a phenomenon. Refugee crisis has now become a strategic problem. When we started the war in Syria, it was a humanitarian headache. The debate was about providing relief to refugees. But now refugees have become elevated to something completely different. And it's an export. It would be a strategic export from the Middle East that is having consequences in Europe, and ultimately Europe and the United States have to find a way to contain this problem. Especially if the wars in the Middle East are going to continue, and they're going to continue to produce refugees, then we have to protect the international order from secondary order consequences that the refugees provide. In terms of the much vaunted and important recalibration of U.S. policy towards Asia, and what was known during the Obama administration as pivot to Asia, the Middle East has in many ways overtly preoccupied the United States' diplomatic and resources. And it's likely to remain a significant focus of U.S. policymaking going forward, and that will have consequences of its own. The Middle East is one of the arenas that is deciding the shape of U.S.-Russia relations going forward. This obviously has dimensions in Europe and elsewhere, but Syria, Iran, Russian involvement in the region for reasons of both opportunism and also the particular interest that Russia has in outcomes in Syria and in the region is also is likely to be to keep the United States engaged in the region. We have not yet come up with a way of managing Russia's involvement in the Middle East, but likely that will become an important factor. Middle East has been a part or the end road to China's One Belt, One Road strategy. China has invested close to $50 billion in Pakistan. It has invested significantly in the Persian Gulf region, and ultimately is investing heavily in Iran, in Turkey, and instability in the Middle East is of significance to how that story will unfold. In addition, I think both China and Russia view the growth of extremism and instability in the Middle East as a particular problem to them. Particularly Russia views Sunni Islamic extremism as a direct threat to Russia. I mean, currently, according to Russia's own estimates, there are close to 10,000 Russian-speaking extremist fighters in Syria that ultimately at some point in time would return to Russia. The Chinese have worries about Uyghurs and how the collapse of order in the Middle East, the growth of terrorism, the vast open territory for extremists to organize and operate in the region, and that instability may ultimately have impact going forward. Now, some of those may suggest that there is room for the international community to have much greater consensus about how to contain and change the dynamic in the Middle East, Russia, the United States, and China, as well as Europe, because all are dealing, if you would, with consequences of instability. Most of them aren't foreseen that have come to the fore. That has thus far not happened. In other words, there has not emerged any kind of a consensus about how to protect the world order from what the worst that the Middle East has produced and is likely to produce going forward. That, I think, is a challenge for not only the next administration, but also for the Chinese and the Russians as well. Thank you very much.
先生、ありがとうございました。アラブ世界の秩序の崩壊、アラブ世界の中での対立の激化と表面化、そして国家権力の崩壊ということが起きている。そのために大変こうした難しい状況の中でテロ、あるいは難民が輸出されているという状況がある。これに対して国際社会は非常に難しい対応を迫られているというお話をいただきました。どうもありがとうございました。皆様もう一度